"You'll land on your feet," my sister said, signing where I hadn't been allowed to. I remember the sound of the pen more than her voice. A soft scratch against paper, confident, final. That was the moment everything shifted. My name is Winnie Gardner. I was 28 years old then, a junior architectural designer still paying off student loans, still believing hard work eventually spoke for itself. I was sitting in a leather chair in a downtown law office that smelled like old books and polished wood, watching my older sister take control of our father's life on paper. Valerie didn't look at me when she signed. She didn't need to. She had already decided how this would go. The attorney slid the folder toward her, not me. That detail stuck. Small things always. Valerie asked questions. I didn't. She smiled politely at the lawyer, thanked him, talked about timelines and logistics like this was a business meeting she'd prepared for. I sat still, hands folded, eyes open. When it was over, Valerie stood first, already slipping into the role she thought she'd earned. Owner, decision maker, survivor. She touched my arm briefly, like a gesture you make when people are watching. "You'll be fine," she said again. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I was listening. Valerie walked out believing she'd taken everything. She hadn't. Valerie always spoke first and no one questioned her. It was that way for as long as I could remember. At family dinners, she told the stories. At school meetings, she answered the questions. At holidays, she decided when things started and when they ended. Adults leaned toward her without realizing it. Teachers smiled at her confidence. Even strangers assumed she was older than she was, more capable, more certain. I learned early that when Valerie talked, the room adjusted itself around her. Growing up, the difference between us wasn't talent or intelligence, it was volume. Valerie filled space effortlessly, I didn't. When relatives visited, they asked her about her plans, her friends, her opinions. I sat beside her, listening, absorbing, waiting. When I did speak, it was usually after she had finished, after the moment had already passed. Our parents never said it outright, but favoritism doesn't need language to exist. It shows up in who gets interrupted and who gets remembered. Valerie got praised for being strong and outgoing. I was described as sweet and quiet, like those were placeholders for something unfinished. At school, Valerie tried everything once: clubs, sports, performances, and walked away as soon as the attention faded. I stuck with what I loved, drawing, measuring, reworking designs until they made sense. I liked things that rewarded patience. Valerie liked things that rewarded presence. Our father, Thomas Gardner, watched all of this without comment. He was a commercial contractor by trade, a man who spent his days solving problems other people couldn't see yet. He didn't raise his voice often. When he did, it meant something had already gone too far. Most of the time, he observed. He noticed how Valerie spoke over people without realizing it. He noticed how I waited until I was certain before I said anything. I think he understood us better than either of us understood ourselves. When our mother died, the imbalance deepened. Valerie stepped into the role of organizer, comforter, spokesperson. Everyone thanked her for being so strong. No one asked how I was holding up. I didn't volunteer the answer. After that, it became assumed that Valerie would handle things. Forms, calls, decisions, I let her, not because I couldn't, but because it was easier to be overlooked than challenged. Silence became my shield. I used it carefully. Even as adults, the pattern held. Valerie chose a career built on presentation. I chose one built on structure. She curated her life. I constructed mine quietly, blueprint by blueprint, deadline by deadline. At family gatherings, she dominated conversations while I refilled drinks and cleared plates. No one ever told me to step back. I just learned where the edges were. At the lawyer's office, watching Valerie sign documents that affected both of us, the memory of all those moments came rushing back. This wasn't new behavior. This was a continuation. Valerie speaking first, the room following. But there was one thing Valerie never noticed. My father had seen it all, every interruption, every assumption, every quiet moment that went unacknowledged. And unlike everyone else, he had remembered. The attorney paused before saying my name. It wasn't dramatic or obvious, but it was just long enough to feel intentional. Long enough for the air in the room to tighten. We were seated around a polished conference table in a downtown law office, the kind with glass walls, framed degrees, and a faint smell of paper and coffee. Outside, traffic moved like nothing important was happening. Inside, my father's life was being translated into legal language. There were witnesses present. My aunt sat beside Valerie, hands folded tightly in her lap. One of my father's former business associates sat across from us, eyes fixed on the table. No one spoke. Grief in that room was quiet, contained, almost formal. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading. The opening was predictable: dates, statements of sound mind, confirmation that everything had been executed properly. Valerie listened at first, then slowly relaxed as the rhythm settled in. She crossed her legs, checked her phone once, already comfortable with where this was going. I kept my hands folded and focused on the sound of his voice. He read through accounts and distributions in a steady, neutral tone. Percentages assigned, instructions delivered without emotion. Valerie nodded occasionally, as if she were approving decisions that had already been made. It all sounded distant to me, like it belonged to another family entirely. Then the attorney paused again. "Winifred Gardner," he said. Hearing my full name out loud made my chest tighten. Valerie turned toward me immediately and placed her hand on my arm. The touch was light, controlled, meant to be noticed. "It's okay," she whispered, just loud enough for the room to hear. "We'll take care of you." The attorney continued without looking up. The section addressed to me was short, shorter than I expected. It mentioned personal effects, sentimental belongings, a modest provision meant to support a transition. The wording felt final, like a quiet ending wrapped in polite language. Valerie exhaled slowly, satisfied. She squeezed my arm once, her sympathy carefully packaged and publicly displayed. The kind of comfort that didn't require a response. I nodded because that's what people do in moments like that. The attorney moved on. This was the part Valerie leaned forward for: property, holdings, trusts, responsibilities. The numbers grew larger, the language became more precise. Valerie's posture shifted completely, her attention sharpening. She asked a clarifying question. The attorney answered, heads nodded around the table. I listened, but not to the totals. I listened for patterns, for phrasing, for anything that sounded like my father. He had always believed that the most important parts of a plan were the ones people skimmed past. Near the end, the attorney read a sentence that didn't fit. It wasn't emphasized. It wasn't explained. It almost sounded like a footnote. A line about contingencies connected to certain assets, about responsibilities transferring along with ownership, about conditions subject to review in cases of misuse or reassignment. No one reacted. Valerie didn't look up. My aunt shifted slightly in her chair. The business associate checked his watch. The attorney continued as if nothing unusual had been said, but that sentence stayed with me. It didn't belong in a document that was otherwise so clean and decisive. It felt deliberate, like something left unfinished on purpose. I replayed it in my head, trying to remember the exact wording. The attorney closed the folder and thanked us for our time. Valerie stood immediately, already talking about next steps, timelines, access. She shook the attorney's hand and smiled, confident and composed. She looked like someone who believed this chapter was closed. I stayed seated for a moment longer. As coats were gathered and polite goodbyes exchanged, the room felt heavier, quieter. I stared at the empty space where the folder had been, replaying that one sentence again and again. It was the only part of the will that didn't feel complete. And even though I didn't yet understand what it meant, I knew one thing. That sentence wasn't meant for Valerie. It was meant for me. Valerie moved in before the flowers from the funeral wilted. I knew because I drove past the house 3 days after we buried my father and saw her car in the driveway. Not visiting, not checking on things. Parked, claimed. The wreath from the service was still hanging crooked on the front door, its ribbon curling at the edges, already starting to fade. The house had always felt solid to me, not fancy, not fragile. It sat on a quiet street lined with old trees and neighbors who waved but didn't pry. My father had chosen it for its bones, good structure, good location, something that would last. Valerie walked into it like it was a prize she'd finally earned. She didn't ask before moving in, she didn't warn me, she simply announced it one evening over the phone, her tone light and efficient. "It just makes sense," she said. "Someone needs to be there to manage things." Manage things? The phrase sounded harmless until I realized what it meant. When I showed up a week later to collect a few more belongings, the house already felt different. The spare key my father had always kept under the planter was gone. The locks hadn't changed yet, but the message was clear enough. Inside, the air smelled faintly of a new candle Valerie favored, something floral and expensive that didn't belong there. My father's coat was no longer hanging by the door. Valerie stood in the kitchen, barefoot, phone pressed between her shoulder and ear, laughing at something I couldn't hear. She glanced at me briefly when she noticed I was there, then turned away to finish her call. I waited. It took longer than it should have. "Oh hey," she said when she finally hung up. "I didn't know you were coming by." I nodded. "I texted." She frowned, then waved it off. "Right, well, things are a bit chaotic right now." The chaos, as far as I could tell, was carefully arranged. Boxes stacked neatly by the wall, new throw pillows on the couch. A planner open on the counter filled with her handwriting. The house was being edited. "I just need a few things," I said. "Of course," she replied. take what you need." The words sounded generous. The reality felt small. As I walked through the rooms, I noticed what was missing. Photos taken down, drawers reorganized, my father's desk cleared except for a lamp and a framed quote Valerie must have added. The house wasn't being preserved, it was being rewritten. In my old bedroom, the bed had been stripped, the closet half emptied. Valerie had turned it into a storage space, boxes labeled and stacked like decisions already made. I stood there longer than necessary, feeling like I was trespassing somewhere that had once been mine. When I came back downstairs with a small bag, Valerie was waiting. "Just so you know," she said casually, "I'll probably have the guest room repurposed soon, since I'll be here full-time." I looked at her. "Full-time?" She smiled. "Well, yes, it's my responsibility now." I didn't argue. I didn't ask where that left me. I didn't say that I hadn't been asked to leave, only slowly erased. Silence had become my reflex, my shield. Before I left, I stood for a moment in the doorway looking back at the living room. The light hit the walls the same way it always had. The bones of the house hadn't changed, but its meaning had. Valerie followed me to the door. "You're okay, right?" she asked, already sounding relieved by the answer she expected. "I'm fine," I said. She hugged me quickly, lightly, like she was checking something off a list. Outside, I sat in my car for a long moment before starting the engine. I watched the house through the windshield, the place where my father had planned, measured, waited. He'd never rushed anything in his life, not work, not decisions, not people. That thought stayed with me as I drove away. My father never rushed decisions. And suddenly, Valerie's speed felt like a mistake waiting to be noticed. "Just take what's sentimental," she said. Valerie stood at the bottom of the stairs, one hand on her hip, the other holding a cardboard box like it weighed nothing at all. The tone of her voice made it clear she'd already decided what counted as sentimental and what didn't. She didn't ask what I wanted. She told me what I was allowed to take. The box was small, smaller than I expected. The kind you'd use to store old papers or decorations you didn't care about anymore. She handed it to me with a quick smile, the same one she used earlier in the week when she told the neighbors she was handling everything now. "There's nothing important left upstairs," she added, already turning away. "I've sorted through most of it." Sorted? The word landed wrong. I carried the box into the living room and set it on the coffee table. The room looked more polished every time I came back. New pillows, different curtains, my father's presence fading in layers. I opened the box slowly, like I was afraid of what I'd confirm if I rushed. Inside were things Valerie had decided didn't matter. Old photos. A few cards, a cracked leather wallet I hadn't seen in years, a watch with a dead battery. Items stripped of context and value, reduced to keepsakes no one wanted to fight over. I picked up the wallet first. It still smelled faintly like my father, leather and sawdust and something clean. I opened it and found nothing inside but an expired ID and a folded receipt. I put it back carefully. The photos came next. Childhood moments, holidays, smiles frozen in time. Valerie wasn't in most of them. That explained why they'd ended up here. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in an old cloth, was an object I didn't recognize at first. It was heavier than it looked. Solid, worn smooth by time and handling. I unwrapped it slowly and found a small wooden piece, hand-carved, simple in design with a faint date etched into one side. I frowned. This didn't belong with the rest. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't sentimental in the way Valerie meant. It felt intentional, useful, like something that had once served a purpose and might again. I turned it over in my hands. The wood was worn where fingers would naturally rest. This wasn't something my father would have kept by accident. He didn't hold onto things without reason. Valerie passed through the room, glanced at the table, and shrugged. "That old thing, I almost tossed it, figured you'd want it." "Why?" I asked. She paused, surprised by the question. "I don't know, it just seemed personal." "Personal?" Another word she used when she didn't want to explain herself. I nodded and said nothing. Silence was easier than pushing, easier than letting her know something had caught my attention. I packed the box back up and taped it closed. Valerie watched from the doorway, relieved, like she'd just finished a task she didn't want to think about again. "See," she said lightly, "this doesn't have to be hard." I carried the box out to my car and placed it gently in the back seat. It felt heavier now than it had inside the house. As I sat behind the wheel, I unwrapped the object again and studied the date etched into the wood. It wasn't random. It matched a year my father had been unusually quiet. A year he'd taken longer routes home. A year he'd started locking certain drawers. I didn't know what the object was yet. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing with certainty. Valerie hadn't given it to me because it was meaningless. She'd given it to me because she didn't understand its weight, and whatever it was, it wasn't meant to be thrown away. People praised Valerie's generosity. They said it in soft voices at first, the way people do when they think kindness should be handled carefully. At the memorial luncheon, at the grocery store, even in passing text messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. She's being so strong, she's handling everything so gracefully. You're lucky to have a sister like that. I nodded when they said it. I smiled when it felt required. Correcting them would have taken energy I didn't have. Valerie leaned into the praise like it was confirmation of something she'd always believed about herself. She spoke in careful tones about responsibility and sacrifice. She told people she'd taken me in, even though I was living out of a suitcase at a friend's place. She said she was making space for me, even as she slowly erased any trace of my presence from the house. In public, she was the generous sister. In private, she barely spoke to me at all. My calls went unanswered. Texts were returned hours later, if at all. When we did talk, it was brief and efficient. Updates about contractors, questions about mail, instructions framed as favors. I learned to stop expecting warmth. At family gatherings, Valerie sat at the center of every conversation, recounting how overwhelming things had been, how much she was juggling. People turned to me with sympathetic looks, their concern already softened by the story she'd told first. "How are you holding up?" Someone asked once, squeezing my hand. "I'm okay," I said. It was easier than explaining how invisible I felt standing 3 feet away from my own sister. I watched her perform grief with just enough emotion to seem sincere. She cried when people were watching, she sighed at the right moments. She spoke about my father in ways that made it sound like she'd known him best. I stayed quiet. At night, when the noise of other people faded, resentment crept in quietly, not sharp, not explosive, just steady. It settled in my chest and refused to leave. I told myself it was temporary, that I needed time, that everything would feel clearer once the dust settled. But it didn't. I found myself replaying moments from the house in my head. The way Valerie had held the box out to me, the casual dismissal in her voice, the object wrapped at the bottom, heavier than it should have been. I started carrying it with me everywhere, tucked safely in my bag. Sometimes I took it out just to feel the weight of it in my hand. Grounding, familiar, like it was reminding me that not everything I'd been given was small. One evening, as I sat alone on the edge of a borrowed bed, I turned it over again and traced the date with my thumb. The more I thought about it, the more it felt deliberate. My father didn't leave things to chance. He left things where they'd be found. Valerie never asked about the box again. She assumed it had been a consolation prize, something harmless, something sentimental and safe. That assumption was starting to feel like her biggest mistake, because while she was busy collecting praise and sympathy, I was paying attention. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't stop thinking about that object. There was a date etched where it didn't belong. I noticed it late one night, sitting cross-legged on the floor of my friend's spare room with the box open in front of me. The house was quiet. Everyone else was asleep. I had taken the object out again, turning it over slowly in my hands, trying to understand why it refused to leave my thoughts. The carving was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A small set of numbers pressed lightly into the wood along one edge, not decorative, not centered, almost hidden. It didn't make sense. My father was careful, methodical. If he marked something, it was for a reason. And this looked intentional, but not meant to be obvious. I ran my thumb over the numbers again. The date was old, older than I expected. It predated the house. Predated several of the things Valerie now claimed had always been hers to manage. That alone made my chest tighten. I tried to place it in my memory. That year had been strange. I remembered my father coming home later than usual, more quiet than normal. He spent evenings at the dining table with folders spread out, papers stacked neatly, a pen resting exactly where he'd need it next. When I asked what he was working on, he'd smiled faintly and said, "Just making sure things are solid." Solid had been his favorite word. He believed in foundation, in planning for stress before it arrived, in leaving markers that only the right person would recognize. At the time, I'd assumed he was talking about work, projects, building. I was starting to wonder if he'd meant something else entirely. I pulled my laptop closer and searched for old emails, notes, anything that might place that year in context, receipts, calendars, my own memories. Slowly, pieces began to line up. That was the year he'd changed attorneys. The year he'd quietly sold a small property he'd never talked about much. The year he'd started asking me questions about my work, about contracts, about contingencies, about what happened when plans changed hands. At the time, I thought he was just curious or trying to connect. Now the questions felt different. I set the object down and stared at it. The weight of it felt heavier now that I understood it wasn't random. It was a marker, a timestamp, a signal. The next morning, I made a decision. I didn't tell Valerie, I didn't ask permission. I drove downtown and requested copies of public records tied to my father's name, deeds, filings, anything dated around that year. I told myself I was just being thorough. I wasn't prepared for how quickly I found it. A legal filing, quiet, buried. Filed under a holding entity I barely recognized, but with my father's signature clear as day. The date matched exactly. Same year, same month, same week. My hands started to shake. The filing wasn't dramatic, no obvious declaration, just the kind of document people skim past because it looks routine. But I knew better now. My father never did anything routine without intention. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eye. Valerie had taken the house, the accounts, the praise, the narrative. She believed the story was finished because the visible parts were settled. But this was beneath the surface. Part of the structure no one looked at unless they knew where to stand. I folded the copy of the filing carefully and placed it back into my bag with the object. They belonged together. I could feel it. For the first time since the will reading, I didn't feel small or displaced. I felt alert, because that date etched into the wood wasn't sentimental, it was a key, and it matched a legal filing Valerie had never seen. Valerie told the lawyer something that wasn't true. It happened casually, the way lies often do when the person telling them doesn't expect to be challenged. We were seated in a smaller conference room this time, just the three of us and the attorney. No witnesses. No audience. Valerie was relaxed, too relaxed, already speaking like someone who believed the outcome was locked. She was explaining how she'd handled the house since our father's passing, repairs, maintenance, decisions she said had to be made quickly. I listened quietly, my hands folded, my bag resting at my feet with the object inside it. And of course, Valerie said, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve, Dad transferred full responsibility to me years ago. He trusted me to manage things if anything happened. The lawyer looked up just briefly. That transfer, she asked, was that formalized? Valerie didn't hesitate. Yes, years back, everything was straightforward. The word everything hung there. I felt it immediately, a tightening behind my ribs. Valerie had answered too fast, too confidently. She hadn't checked a document, she hadn't clarified, she'd assumed the truth would bend to her certainty. The lawyer nodded slowly and made a note. I'll need to see that paperwork, she said evenly. Valerie smiled. Of course. I'll send it over. She glanced at me then, quick and sharp, as if daring me to say something. I didn't. Silence had become my advantage, but inside something clicked into place. The filing I'd found the night before hadn't transferred responsibility. It had done the opposite. It had set conditions, limits, triggers that depended on behavior, not confidence. Valerie couldn't produce paperwork that didn't exist. The rest of the meeting blurred. Valerie talked. The lawyer listened. I watched the space between them carefully. The pauses, the slight shifts in tone, the way the lawyer asked follow-up questions Valerie didn't seem prepared for. When we stood to leave, Valerie was still smiling, still sure of herself. In the hallway, she leaned toward me. See, she said softly. Everything's under control. I nodded again, but this time I wasn't agreeing. Outside, the air felt colder than it had earlier. I walked a few steps behind Valerie as we left the building. She was already on her phone, talking about dinner plans, her voice light and unaffected. I stopped near the steps and watched her for a moment, noticing how easily she moved when she thought no one was paying attention. That was the thing about Valerie. She believed momentum was proof. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. I replayed the conversation in my head, word by word. The lie wasn't dramatic, it wasn't malicious, it was convenient, and that made it dangerous. My father had planned for convenience. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folded copy of the filing. I read it again, slower this time, tracing the language with my finger. The conditions were clear if you knew how to look. The kind of clarity lawyers respected. The kind that didn't care who spoke first. I realized then that staying silent wasn't enough anymore. I needed confirmation, context, someone who would read what Valerie hadn't and understand why it mattered. I took out my phone. There was only one number I wanted to call, the attorney who had handled the filing years ago, whose name appeared at the bottom of the page in careful print. I'd hesitated before, unsure if I was overthinking things. I wasn't anymore. The phone rang twice before someone answered. Law offices of. I stepped away from the car, my voice steady. Hi, I said, my name is Winnie Gardner. I have a question about a document my father filed years ago. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a shift. Yes, the voice said slowly, I remember him. I closed my eyes. I made one quiet phone call. Did your father ever mention conditions? Marilyn Cross didn't ask it casually. She leaned back slightly in her chair, pen resting between her fingers, eyes steady on my face. The question landed with weight, like she already suspected the answer mattered. Her office was quieter than the others I'd been in. Smaller, less polished, no glass walls or sweeping city views, just shelves of neatly labeled binders and a desk worn smooth at the edges. This was a place where things were handled, not displayed. I shook my head slowly. Not directly, I said. But he talked about planning, about making sure things held up under pressure. Marilyn nodded once as if that confirmed something. That sounds like him. She had known my father longer than I realized, not socially, professionally. She explained that he'd come to her years earlier with a very specific concern. He hadn't wanted drama, he hadn't wanted conflict, he wanted structure, safeguards, a way to ensure responsibility followed control. He didn't trust appearances, she said plainly. He trusted behavior. She asked me to show her what I'd brought. I took the object from my bag and placed it on the desk, along with the folded copy of the filing. Marilyn studied the wood first, turning it over carefully, then glanced at the date etched into its side. That's not decorative, she said, that's a marker. My pulse quickened. She unfolded the document next, reading it slowly, line by line. Her face didn't change, but her attention sharpened. She paused at one paragraph, then another, tapping the page lightly with her pen. This is a conditional trust framework, she said finally, not ownership transfer, oversight. I frowned. So Valerie. Valerie assumed control, Marilyn interrupted gently. That's not the same thing. She explained it carefully, breaking down the language into something I could follow. My father had structured certain assets so that responsibility came with rules, conditions tied to use, behavior, transparency, the kind of details people skipped when they believed confidence was enough. And the house? I asked. Marilyn looked up at me. The house is governed by those conditions. My chest tightened. She's already moved in, she's making changes. Marilyn's expression remained calm, which may be relevant. I swallowed. She told another attorney that everything had been formally transferred years ago. Marilyn's mouth curved slightly, not a smile but something close. Did she provide proof? No. Then she made an assumption, Marilyn said, and assumptions don't hold up well in court. The room felt suddenly smaller, heavier, not with fear but with clarity. Marilyn slid the papers back toward me. Your father didn't leave things unfinished, she said. He left them conditional, that's different. I stared at the object on the desk. It no longer felt mysterious, it felt intentional. A signal meant for someone who would stop and ask why. So what does this mean? I asked quietly. Marilyn met my eyes. It means you need to be careful and patient. With what? With timing, she replied, and with information. I nodded slowly. This wasn't about rushing in or confronting Valerie. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about letting the structure my father built do its work. Marilyn gathered the documents neatly. I'll review everything in detail, she said, but based on what I see so far. She paused, choosing her words. You may not have lost anything, she said. The sentence hung in the air long after she finished speaking. For the first time since the will had been read, I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not triumph, possibility. And I knew then that whatever Valerie thought she'd taken, the story wasn't over yet. Valerie skimmed. My father didn't. That was the difference between them, and it was finally starting to matter. Marilyn laid the documents out across her desk in a neat row, the way my father used to lay out blueprints when he wanted to explain why a structure worked or why it failed. She didn't rush, she didn't summarize, she read every line, every clause. The parts most people skipped because they looked boring or harmless. Your sister read this like a receipt, Marilyn said calmly. Your father wrote it like a contract. She tapped the first page. This isn't a simple inheritance, it's a layered trust. Ownership, control, and benefit are separated on purpose. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the edge of the chair. Separated how? Ownership stays with the trust, she explained. Control is conditional, benefits depend on behavior. The words settled slowly. I thought back to the will reading, to the sentence that hadn't fit, to the way Valerie had already started making decisions like the house belonged to her outright. She assumed possession meant permission, Marilyn continued, but your father didn't design it that way. She pointed to a section halfway down the page. This clause governs use of the property. It requires transparency, shared access, and good faith management. Any attempt to exclude another named beneficiary triggers review. My breath caught exclude. I pictured Valerie changing the house before the funeral flowers had faded, repurposing rooms, talking about full-time occupancy, telling people she was handling everything now. She never mentioned any of that to me, I said. Marilyn nodded, because she didn't read this far. She moved on to the next section. Here's the contingency logic. If conditions are violated, authority shifts, temporarily at first, then permanently if corrective action isn't taken. Shifts to who? I asked. Marilyn looked at me directly. To the beneficiary who complies. The room felt suddenly very quiet. So Valerie didn't take everything, I said slowly. She took responsibility. Yes, Marilyn replied. And responsibility is heavy when you don't know you're carrying it. Yeah. I thought about all the praise Valerie had been collecting. The sympathy, the admiration, how easy it had looked from the outside. None of those people knew what came attached to the house, to the accounts, to the decisions she'd been making without hesitation. What are the stakes? I asked. Marilyn didn't soften her answer. Financial liability, legal exposure, loss of control, and depending on how far things go, reputational damage. I swallowed. And me? I asked. What happens to me? Marilyn folded her hands. You remain protected. That was your father's priority. Protected? The word felt strange and comforting at the same time. She gathered the pages and slid them back into the folder. Your father anticipated imbalance, she said. He anticipated confidence without caution. He built safeguards for that. I closed my eyes briefly, picturing him at the dining table years ago, papers spread out, pen placed just so, making sure things were solid. When does this come into play? I asked. Marilyn hesitated for the first time. It already has. My heart skipped. What do you mean? She opened the folder again and pointed to a highlighted line. Unauthorized exclusion of a named beneficiary from shared property access. I felt a chill move through me. The locks, I said quietly, the way she moved in, the way she talked about the house. Marilyn nodded. Those actions matter. I leaned back, my thoughts racing. Valerie hadn't just skimmed the document. She'd walked straight past the part that required care, the part that demanded restraint. The part that assumed humility. My father had known exactly who would read what and who wouldn't. Marilyn closed the folder with a soft, final sound. You don't need to confront her, she said. In fact, I'd advise against it. Then what do I do? You wait, she replied, and you document. I nodded slowly, because for the first time I understood the full shape of what was happening. Valerie hadn't just taken the house. She'd stepped into a role she didn't understand, and one condition had already been broken. Valerie bragged to the wrong people. The dinner was her idea. A small gathering, she called it, nothing formal. Just a chance to thank everyone who'd been so supportive and show that things were finally settling down. She hosted it at the house, of course, the house she now spoke about as if it had always answered to her name. I arrived a few minutes late on purpose. The dining room looked different, updated, styled. Valerie had rearranged the furniture so the table sat closer to the window, catching the light just right. Candles flickered, music played softly in the background. It felt curated like everything else she touched. There were 6 of us in total, a couple of family friends, one of Valerie's coworkers. And Marilyn Cross. Valerie didn't realize why that mattered yet. She greeted everyone with ease, glass already in hand, moving through the room like a host who knew she belonged at the center of things. When she saw Marilyn, she smiled wider than usual. I'm so glad you could make it, she said. I thought it would be nice for everyone to finally relax. Marilyn returned the smile politely. Thank you for inviting me. I took my seat quietly and folded my hands in my lap. Dinner moved quickly. Valerie talked. Everyone listened. She recounted the past few weeks like a success story, how overwhelming things had been, how much responsibility she'd taken on, how hard it was to manage everything alone. I didn't realize how much Dad relied on me, she said, shaking her head with practiced humility. But someone had to step up. People nodded sympathetically, someone murmured how strong she was. Valerie accepted the praise with a gracious smile. I watched her carefully. She spoke about the house next, the renovations she was planning, the changes she'd already started. She talked about future dinners, future holidays, future plans, all framed as if they were already approved. I want to make the space my own, she said lightly. It's time. Marilyn set her fork down. Valerie didn't notice. She was already moving on, telling a story about a contractor she'd spoken to earlier that week, about timelines, about budgets, about how relieved she was to finally have clarity. I stayed quiet, not out of fear, out of patience. When Valerie mentioned changing the locks, she laughed. I mean, it's just practical, she said. You can't be too careful these days. There it was. The table went still for half a second, long enough for me to feel it, long enough for Marilyn to look up. Oh, Marilyn said gently, you've changed the locks. Valerie waved a hand. Not officially yet, but I'm planning to. It's my responsibility now. Marilyn tilted her head slightly. Your responsibility in what capacity? Valerie blinked just once, as the primary holder of the property. I felt my heart start to pound, but I kept my face neutral. This wasn't the moment to interrupt. Marilyn nodded slowly. And you're comfortable making unilateral changes? Of course, Valerie said. Everything was transferred to me, years ago actually. The room grew quiet. I watched Marilyn closely. The way she placed her napkin down, the way she folded her hands, the way she didn't rush to respond. Valerie, Marilyn said calmly, would you mind clarifying which document you're referring to? Valerie hesitated just a fraction. The trust, she said. The arrangement Dad set up. Marilyn's eyes flicked briefly to me, then back to Valerie. Interesting, she said, because the arrangement I reviewed doesn't allow for exclusion or unilateral modification. Valerie laughed a little too quickly. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Marilyn's expression didn't change. I don't believe there has. The air in the room shifted. Someone cleared their throat, someone else looked down at their plate. Valerie straightened in her chair. I've been handling everything, she said firmly. No one else questioned it. Marilyn nodded. That doesn't make it compliant. Silence fell like a curtain. I sat very still, my pulse loud in my ears. This wasn't confrontation, this was exposure, the kind that happens slowly in front of witnesses. Marilyn reached for her glass, took a sip, then set it down carefully. I think, she said evenly, we should pause this conversation until everyone understands the structure they're operating within. Valerie opened her mouth to respond, and that was when Marilyn cleared her throat. The sound was small, but it changed everything. Valerie's smile froze. It happened in real time right there at the table. 1 second she was still in control, glass in hand, posture perfect, voice steady, and the next her expression stalled like a thought that couldn't find its way out. She laughed softly as if to brush past the tension, but the sound didn't land. It just hung there. Marilyn didn't rush her. That was the part that made it worse. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder, setting it gently beside her plate. The movement was unremarkable, almost polite, but everyone at the table noticed. Conversations stopped. Forks paused halfway to mouths. I wasn't planning to bring this up tonight, Marilyn said evenly, but since certain assumptions have been stated publicly, it's important to be clear. Valerie set her glass down a little too carefully. I think this is getting unnecessary, she said. We were just talking. Marilyn nodded. You were, I am now. She opened the folder and slid a single page forward, not toward Valerie but toward the center of the table. A quiet invitation or a warning. This document, Marilyn continued, outlines the governing structure attached to the primary property in question. Valerie leaned in, squinting at the page. I've seen all this, she said. It's standard. It isn't, Marilyn replied. The word landed flat and final. Valerie's smile tried to return, failed. I don't understand what you're implying. Marilyn didn't look at her right away. She glanced around the table, acknowledging the others without addressing them directly. What I'm saying, she said, is that control and ownership are not the same thing. The room felt smaller, heavier. Valerie's voice sharpened. That house was left to me. It was entrusted, Marilyn corrected, conditionally. Valerie shook her head. No, that's not. It is, Marilyn said, calm, certain. And those conditions were triggered. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. I felt every eye turn toward me, then back to Valerie. She sat very still now, hands flat against the table like movement might make things worse. Triggered how? She asked finally. Marilyn folded her hands. By exclusion, by unilateral decisions, by misrepresentation. Valerie laughed again, but this time there was no confidence in it. This is ridiculous, she said. Everyone knows I've been managing things. Managing, Marilyn said gently, doesn't grant authority. Something in Valerie's posture collapsed just slightly, her shoulders dipped, her voice lowered. This feels personal, she said. It isn't, Marilyn replied, it's structural. That was when I spoke, not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to be heard. I never asked to be excluded, I said. Every head turned. Valerie looked at me like she'd forgotten I was there, like she was seeing me for the first time in weeks, not as a background presence but as a variable she hadn't accounted for. I didn't ask for the locks to be changed, I continued. I didn't ask to be told when I could come by, I didn't agree to any of this. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. You said you were fine, she said. I said I was quiet, I replied. There's a difference. Marilyn nodded once as if that settled something. She turned back to Valerie. The trust is explicit, she said. Actions that restrict a named beneficiary's access constitute a breach. Once that happens, authority is subject to review. Valerie's hands curled into fists. So what are you saying, she asked, that I lose everything? Marilyn met her gaze. I'm saying that asset was never yours alone. The words landed hard. Valerie stared at the table, at the page in front of her, at the room that no longer felt like it was bending around her. The version of herself she'd been performing for weeks didn't fit anymore. No one spoke. No one moved. I felt something settle in my chest, not victory, not relief. Balance, because for the first time since this had begun, the story wasn't being told by the loudest voice in the room. It was being told by the truth. She didn't take money. She took obligation. That was the part no one had explained to Valerie, and the part she never bothered to ask about. She had focused on the visible things, the house, the accounts, the authority. She had mistaken possession for freedom. What she'd actually inherited was weight. Marilyn spoke calmly, her voice steady as she laid it out piece by piece. The trust didn't just grant access to assets, it assigned responsibility. Legal, financial, and ethical responsibility. Maintenance costs, tax exposure. Liability for decisions made without approval. The kind of burden that doesn't show up in congratulatory messages or sympathetic hugs. Valerie listened at first with disbelief, then with something closer to panic. You're telling me I'm on the hook for all of that? She asked, her voice tight. Yes, Marilyn said, because you acted as though you were in sole control. Valerie shook her head. I didn't know. That doesn't change the outcome, Marilyn replied. It explains it, it doesn't undo it. The room felt unbalanced now, like furniture had been shifted too quickly and nothing quite lined up anymore. Valerie's confidence drained in stages, her shoulders slumped, her eyes flicked toward me then away again. This isn't fair, she said quietly. I didn't respond. Fairness had never been part of her calculations before. Marilyn continued, not unkindly but without cushioning the truth. The trust required cooperation, transparency, shared access. By moving in immediately, changing the locks, and representing herself as sole authority, Valerie had assumed obligations she didn't understand. You took on management, Marilyn said, and with it, risk. Valerie's breath came faster now. So what happens? Marilyn paused. That depends on how things proceed from here. Valerie looked around the table as if searching for someone to rescue her from the consequences of her own certainty. No one stepped in. The room had shifted. The audience she'd counted on was gone. She pressed her hands flat against the table. I thought I was doing the right thing, she said. Maybe you were, Marilyn replied, but your father planned for intention and outcome to be two separate things. That was when it clicked for me. This wasn't punishment, it wasn't revenge, it was design. My father hadn't left traps or tricks behind, he'd left structure, a system that revealed character through action. Valerie hadn't failed because she was malicious. She failed because she rushed. Because she assumed control without reading the terms. I remembered him at the dining table years ago, papers spread out, pen aligned just so, taking his time, making sure things held. Valerie looked at me again, her expression stripped of performance now. "Did you know about this?" she asked. "No," I said honestly, but I paid attention. Her eyes filled with something close to regret, or maybe fear, it was hard to tell. Marilyn gathered her papers and closed the folder. "Your father anticipated imbalance," she said. "He anticipated speed without understanding." The words settled heavily in the room. Valerie leaned back in her chair, suddenly smaller than she'd been all evening. The house, the authority, the narrative, none of it felt secure anymore. She had taken what looked like everything and discovered it came with strings she couldn't see. As we stood to leave, I caught one last glimpse of the object in my bag, the small carved piece of wood with the date etched into its side. It no longer felt mysterious. It felt like a message delivered on time, because my father hadn't left things unfinished. My father had anticipated this. I didn't win, I reclaimed myself. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled slowly in the quiet days that followed the dinner, when the noise died down and the story people had been telling themselves began to crack. Valerie stopped calling. The group messages went silent. The house that had felt so final just weeks earlier, no longer felt like a verdict hanging over me. I noticed the shift first in small ways. People who had once spoken around me now spoke to me. Questions came my way instead of past me. The lawyer followed up directly with me, not as an afterthought, but as someone whose voice mattered in the process. Nothing had been transferred yet, nothing dramatic had happened. And yet everything felt different. Valerie had lost her momentum. She was still living in the house, but the certainty she'd wrapped herself in was gone. Decisions stalled. Plans paused. She had taken control too fast, and now she didn't know how to hold it without tightening her grip. I could feel the tension even from a distance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't adjusting myself to match her pace. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. Nothing fancy, clean lines, good light, a place that felt intentionally mine. I set up a drafting table by the window and went back to work with a focus I hadn't felt in years. Designs came easier, decisions felt clearer. I stopped waiting for permission I'd never been given anyway. People assume empowerment looks loud, like confrontation, like victory speeches and raised voices. For me, it looked like distance. I didn't show up unannounced. I didn't argue. I didn't correct the story Valerie was still telling herself. I let the structure my father built do what it was meant to do. I let time apply pressure. When Valerie finally reached out, her message was careful, neutral. She asked how I was. She asked if we could talk. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had shifted. Just an awareness that something had. I read the message twice. Then I put my phone down. That was when I understood the real change. I no longer felt the need to respond immediately or at all. I thought about my father again, how he'd never rushed decisions, even when people expected him to. How he believed that the strongest plans didn't announce themselves. They revealed themselves. I had spent most of my life being quiet because it felt safer, easier, less disruptive. Now my silence felt different. It wasn't avoidance, it was choice. I met Marilyn one last time to review updates. She confirmed what I already knew. The process was moving. Slowly, correctly. Valerie was learning what it meant to operate within boundaries she hadn't bothered to read. "You handled this well," Marilyn said. I shook my head. I just didn't interfere. She smiled slightly. "Sometimes that's the hardest part." On my way home, I stopped by a park and sat on a bench with the object resting in my bag beside me. The small carved piece of wood no longer felt heavy. It felt complete, a marker that had done its job. At 28, I hadn't gained a house. I hadn't gained public sympathy or praise. I hadn't even gained clarity all at once. What I'd gained was something quieter. I trusted myself. I trusted my instincts, my patience, my ability to see what others rushed past. I no longer needed to be seen as generous or strong or accommodating. I didn't need to compete for space that had never been evenly shared. I stood up, slung my bag over my shoulder, and walked back to my car with a calm I hadn't felt before. That night, I finally replied to Valerie's message, not with anger, not with explanation, just one sentence: "I need some space." I hit send, set the phone down, and turned off the light. I had made one final decision. Silence isn't weakness, it's selection. It took me a long time to understand that. For most of my life, silence was something I used to stay out of the way, to keep things calm, to avoid being misunderstood or dismissed outright. I thought being quiet meant I was choosing peace. What I didn't realize was that I was also choosing to be overlooked. This experience changed that. What I learned is that silence can mean very different things depending on when and why you use it. There's the kind that comes from fear, and then there's the kind that comes from clarity. One shrinks you, the other protects you. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront my sister in a dramatic showdown. I didn't demand apologies or explanation. I let the truth surface on its own terms through structure and timing and patience. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood where my power actually lived. Dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush to correct every wrong or prove every point. Dignity waits until it's necessary to speak, and then it speaks once. Watching Valerie struggle with the weight of what she'd taken taught me something important. Dominance looks impressive until it's tested. Control feels secure until it comes with responsibility. Confidence, when it isn't paired with care, eventually collapses under its own speed. My father knew that. He didn't leave instructions meant to punish. He left a framework meant to reveal. He trusted time to do what confrontation couldn't. He trusted that the person who moved fastest wouldn't always be the one who understood the ground beneath them. For the first time, I understood him completely. I also understood myself. I stopped explaining my choices to people who didn't live with the consequences. I stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. I stopped mistaking access for obligation. Distance became something I used intentionally, not to avoid, but to protect what mattered. There was no grand ending. No moment where everyone clapped or admitted they were wrong. Real life doesn't work that way. What happened instead was quieter and far more lasting. The balance shifted. I went back to my work with a steadiness I'd never had before. I made decisions without checking how they would look to anyone else. I trusted my judgment. I trusted my pace. And when people spoke over me, I no longer waited for a pause that might never come. I created my own. Silence, when chosen, is powerful. It filters out noise. It exposes impatience. It lets other people reveal themselves without interference. And when you finally do speak, your words land differently because they aren't chasing attention. They're carrying truth. If you've ever been the quiet one in the room, the person others assume will adapt or step aside, I want you to know this: being calm doesn't mean being powerless. It means you're paying attention. And attention paired with patience changes outcomes. You don't have to win to reclaim yourself. You don't have to dominate to be respected. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait, then choose carefully. If this story reminded you of someone, subscribe. Some truths take time.